Hello and welcome to variation 37. This is our last variation on flying staccato, and if flying staccato is new for you, I would recommend that you work through variations 28, 30, 33 and 36 first. I go into a lot more detail of how to learn flying staccato in the variations 28, 30 and 33, and this variation will be a lot easier for you if you've already learned flying staccato, worked through the previous flying staccato variations and have a good grounding. The basis of flying staccato are repeated up bows staying in one place. And we need this technique particularly here because we have the flying staccato in 2/16 notes and then 1/8 notes. So the rhythm is changing within our flying staccato. So we need this technique. So even if you can already do this, repeat it before you practice this variation. It's a very, very good preparation exercise for this variation. Remember, it's done with a circular motion, which is done by your fingers. In slow motion, it looks like this. In tempo, it becomes passive. It just reacts to what the bow is doing. The movement is much smaller, hardly visible, but you feel the resistance of the string very strongly in your hand, and this we need particularly for this variation. We need it for flying staccato in general, but particularly in this variation we need to feel the resistance of the string very well. So you feel the resistance and your hand just reacts. Your wrist is comparatively high, so your hand can hang and your fingers can be loose so that they can react. If you tense up your fingers, you can't react, and then you have to do it with your whole arm, and that doesn't sound good and it also won't work. Remember to tilt your bow a little bit for this bowing, because if you play with all the hairs and your stick above the hairs, you have too much tension in the hairs, the bow will bounce too high and you get too much noise, it doesn't sound good. So to reduce the tension of the hairs, you tilt the bow stick towards the fingerboard a little bit, and that will stop the bow from bouncing too high. And you get a more softer, brushy sound. So practice this a little bit before you start practicing this variation, even if you can already do it, just to remember the feeling of the resistance of the string and the reaction of your fingers. They have to be very loose. So basically I always imagine my hand and bow hanging from my wrist, and this is very loose and can react. Next, practice going into those repeated up bows coming from a longer note. Notice that I put a small accent at the end of the long note to get the bow to lift off. I do that accent with a little bit of weight and a little bit of bow speed, a little bit of acceleration, but I let the bow lift off so the acceleration doesn't go anywhere. It goes up, it doesn't go forward. That gets the bow to lift off. We will need this in this variation because the first two of our flying staccato are 16th notes. So we need the speed of the 16th notes. So we need to practice the lift off. And then you can go on forever with the repeated up bows. But put a small accent at the end of the long note, little bit of weight, little bit of bow speed acceleration, and have the acceleration go up. exaggerate that a little bit at first, you will notice that that gets the bow to take off. It gets it to lift off of the string. Notice how we're already working with 3 different bow speeds. We have the long note, then we have the increased bow speed at the end of the long note for the small accent, and then we more or less have no bow speed because we're staying in one place. You should be very conscious of that, because this we're going to need when we have the 16th notes before we have the 8th notes, because they are quite fast. Since this is such a passive bowing, we can only influence the bow to bounce at the speed we want it to bounce. We're not actually actively doing every bounce. We influence this with acceleration, bow speed, and also reducing bow speed. It's a little bit like slamming on the brakes, and influencing how high the bow bounces. One doesn't let the bow bounce so high for the 16th notes because that would take it too far away from the string, and then to have it bounce slower for the 8th notes, we allow the bow to bounce higher. So those are our possibilities of influencing the bow. And start off with just doing 2 16th notes and 1 8th note. In your hand, it will feel as if you're accelerating for that little accent and immediately slamming on the brakes. That's why it's so important to feel the resistance of the string. Adding more 8th notes is not much of a problem. It's getting the first 2 16th notes to be clear but also fast enough. So it's literally accelerating with that little accent that gets the bow to lift off, and as you lift off you're more or less slamming on the brakes, and that's where you need this staying in one place. The 2 16th notes, we reduce the bow speed to almost 0. We're not completely staying in one place because to make a full circle that would take too long, but we're almost staying in one place. As a reminder, flying staccato is very closely related to ricochet, our most passive bowing. And in ricochet, we influence the speed of the ricochet by adding weight or taking weight away. For example, if I don't have much weight, the bow bounces slowly. If I add more weight, the bow will bounce a lot faster. So you might just want to do that once or twice to remember that you get the bow to bounce faster if you add a little bit of weight, because that's what we do for the 2 16th notes to get it to bounce faster, and then we take weight away for the 8th notes to get it to bounce slower. You add a little bit of weight as you do the 16th notes, first for the accent and also when the 16th note comes down again. And then you take weight away for the bow to bounce slower for the following 8th notes. And that is a good thing to practice, to get used to before you're actually playing the variation. That's what the bow has to do. So you notice we're working with different bow speeds and different weight all at the same time. With the bow speed we have the long note, then we have an increased bow speed for that little accent, then we reduce the bow speed for the 16th notes, and then we increase it again for the 8th notes. It feels in the hand as if one gives an accent with weight and then takes the weight away after the 16th notes are over. It feels like one slams on the brakes. One does accelerate a little bit at the end of the long note, a little bit, but the actual feeling is more as if one's slamming on the brakes, and as if one's slamming on the brakes with a bit of acceleration before. Sometimes they don't all come off. If they don't come off, what immediately helps is to remember to feel the resistance of the string in your hand. Practice this in scales as well. Practice that in scales so that the movement that the bow is doing becomes completely natural. It shouldn't be difficult anymore. As soon as you've organized what you're doing with speed and weight, you have the long note, then you add a bit of weight for the accent and for the 2/16th notes, and then you take weight away for the 8th notes. And also notice how much higher the bow bounces in the 8th notes than in the 16th notes. So you're slamming on the brakes for the 16th notes. That makes them faster and the bow bounces less high. And then you take weight away for the 8th notes. That makes them slower and the bow bounces higher. Make sure you can really do this before you start playing it in the variation, because you need to be able to focus completely on your bow to get all of that organized, and it should be fairly automatic after you've practiced it in scales for a while, because you're repeating it over and over. Give yourself time to practice the left hand. I know I say this in every variation, but it's particularly true in the variations where we have very passive bowings, because the left hand has to follow the bow. The bow can't wait for the left hand to be in place. Certainly not in this variation, because those 16th notes are quite fast. Also, we need a lot of concentration for our bow, because we're working with different bow speeds, we're working with different weight on the string, and we need quite a lot of concentration to do this, and we can't have to think about what the left hand is doing. So the left hand should be easy for you, which means you should practice the left hand until it's easy for you. Make it very easy for the bow when you're practicing the left hand. Just keep the bow on the string. And practice that until it's easy. Slightly increase the speed with some time. Keep the bow on the string so that it's easy for the bow and you don't have to think about the bow, so that you can put your concentration on the left hand until you notice that the left hand is easy and you don't have to think about it so much anymore. I have a couple of fingering suggestions for you. In bar 9, I go into second position. I do that because I'd like to keep bar 9 on the A string so that I can play bar 9 through 12 all on the D and A string and not have any E string, because that comes later. I just think it sounds better. I just think that sounds nicer. In bar 15, I also have a fingering suggestion for you. I go into second position and then I go into first. I found that fingering easier because I only have to shift twice and not 3 times. And at the end, I go into half position. Now half position and back into first position. So these are a couple of fingering suggestions for you which you might find useful. When putting both hands together, remember your bow can already do this if you've practiced this in scales. If you've practiced that, then your bow can do it. Now it's just a matter of coordinating it with the left hand. The first of the 16th notes is what we did as the little accent when we did it on one note. So when you're putting both hands together, just practice that a few times. Notice how you're giving a bit of an accent, you're increasing the weight a little bit, you're slightly increasing the speed only to slam on the brakes afterwards. And then you add the other 8th notes. And just practice that a few times. Another thing which helps a lot is to actually practice this slowly, because when you're doing this bowing slowly, you're increasing the height of bouncing. That I found very helpful because it's a bit of an exaggerated practice. Everything else is the same. You're still putting a small accent onto the first 16th note to get the bow to lift off. You're also not bouncing as high for the 16th notes as for the 8th notes. It still feels a little bit like you're slamming on the brakes, but you're bouncing higher and it's a little bit exaggerated. So that I also found very useful. Remember to feel the resistance of the string in your bow hand, particularly first finger. That's one of the reasons why practicing this slowly is a good idea, because you can feel the resistance better in a slower tempo. Then gradually speed it up. Now we have a lot of notes on the up bow and only 2 notes on the down bow. That means that our down bow has to travel with quite a high speed because we've got to get all the way to the tip, or nearly to the tip, because we need all the bow for the up bow. So when you're playing with such a high bow speed, remember to feel the string, have good contact with the string. So again, you're feeling the string in your first finger of your bow hand. You need quite a bit of weight because otherwise you get... So you need quite a bit of weight and feel the string, good contact with the string. Notice how many different bow speeds we have just within one of the figures. We have a comparatively high bow speed for the long note. Then we have almost a standstill for the 2 16th notes. Then we have a higher bow speed for the remaining 8th notes and a very high bow speed for the down bow. So we're really working with different bow speeds, and remember, Don't let the 16th notes bounce too high. You're adding a bit of weight to stop them from bouncing too high, and you're taking weight away for the remaining 8 notes, allowing them to bounce higher. So this is quite complicated. That's why it's so important to build it up step by step so that you really know what you're doing. Most important is to feel the resistance of the string in your bow hand. Okay, I hope you find this useful. As always, of course, let me know if you have any questions, and happy practicing.